Hello and most welcome to the promised age 857, and today I'm taking up an article by Graham Priest in the Journal of Philosophy already from the year 1998, and it's named "What's So Bad About Contradiction?" And it's a rather devastating attack on logocentrism. It's an article I read before, but it did not get its full power until I read the book about Rodolphe Gasset. And this is one of the things where deconstruction is absolutely necessary to fully understand how devastating, how crucial this criticism is, an actual criticism from Graham Priest, something that you can actually do within logic only, I would say. That's the only area where you can perform cleanly criticism. But it is more devastating within logic. It takes away a lot, but it also shows us the way from a misunderstanding of thinking itself or logic itself and what it means to be rational. To be absurdly short, there is a general tendency to think that logic and rationality is the very same thing. And I would say that conclusion is not even a conclusion. That is obvious from experience. But what Graham Priest shows, as the mirror shows, it is not necessarily so. And when it's not necessarily so, logic doesn't hold. It's completely dependent on necessity. That's what makes the laws of logic supposedly different than the laws of anything else. These are necessary laws. I just decided to take this in two parts. This is going to be the initial part, and in the second part I'm going to repeat it. And when it comes to deconstruction, repetition is everything. You do it only one time, it won't hit the surface, because that's the usual so-called knowledge. That thing you can get immediately. It's hardly sophisticated, it's superficial, it just has the chain of knowledge. It's never even close to knowledge. It's very far from. There are four things that Graham Priest takes up in the article. First, contradictions entail everything. Second, contradictions cannot be true. 3, contradictions cannot be believed rationally. 4, if contradictions were acceptable, people could never be rationally criticized. 5, if contradictions were acceptable, no one could deny anything. And he has, for each of these, he has an objection. The first objection is to the first one: contradictions entail everything. And you can see that as a usual view of the mirror. If you have the both sides, you have everything. Or if you have a polarity in the text, both those polarities cover everything in the text. Something that never is the case, I would say, but commonly believed to be the truth. And the objection is that rational belief is closed under entailment, but a contradiction entails everything. Hence, if someone believed a contradiction, they ought to believe everything which is too much. If you contradict one thing, everything outside that thing is a contradiction. And Graham Priest certainly believes that believing everything is too much. But there is a very important difference between some and all. Far from everything is actually closed under entailment. And this is the lesson from the paradox of the preface. You write a non-fictional book under some topic, history for instance, karate, cooking. You research it as thoroughly as possible. The evidence for the claims in your book, A1 to A9, is as convincing as empirically possible. Hence, you endorse them rationally. Nonetheless, as you are well aware, there is independent inductive evidence of a very strong kind that virtually all substantial factual books that have been written contain some false claims. Hence, you also believe that the contradiction to what you say is not true, but you do not believe that the contradiction to what you say and what you say covers everything. And this is a grander problem. And I think very few people realize this on a daily basis. There are a few philosophers like Derrida and quantum physics, I would say, that have to come to understand that. In quantum mechanics by necessity, whereas Derrida did it completely voluntarily. But it's very hard to understand this is a major problem in everything that you do think correctly. The earliest form of articulated logic was Aristotle's syllogism. This was not explosive, oddly enough. This is called explosion, where the contradiction is everything. Consider the inference: some men are mortals, no mortals are men, hence all men are men. This is not a valid syllogism, though the premise are inconsistent. According to Aristotle, some syllogism with inconsistent premises are valid, and some are not. So what Aristotle had was a propositional as well as a syllogistic logic. It was never clearly articulated, and what it was rather unclear. For what it is worth, however, this does not seem to have been explosive either. In particular, a contradiction A and A negative does not entail all its conjuncts. And that is actually the zest of it, the idea that what is and what is not covers everything. That's the zest of it. How's another way of looking at this? It's like there is a gestalt from the beginning, and that gestalt is outside of yourself is everything, or the universe and the walls of universe, that covers everything. Everything that exists and everything that doesn't exist is inside the walls of the universe. This disproves this, and it does so not from empiricism or induction. it does so by showing explosion is impossible. It does not simply work, not as people think. And crucial at the bottom of this is the very important difference between some and all. And we should maybe be very careful when we look into contradictions that have all explicit or implicit in the proposition, or when something is instead implied, as in some. As usual, this difference is clearly followed in all Eastern languages. It's just in Western languages this crucial distinction is not made. And if it's not made, it means that you have somewhat severed the bond between what is rational and what is the formal notification of it, the logic of it. You sever that band, and the representation of rationality is not rationality. I think that's obvious. But somehow in the Western society, to express oneself in a certain manner that follow a certain pattern that reminds you of a sound proposition following in a syllogistic manner or a similar ordered manner, does not entail that it's neither true or false. That can only be judged rationally. It implies that we today most probably are trusting that this process goes by itself, and we do not have to look closer into the whatever subject it could be. I directly think of politics, that the public trusts the politicians and the ones who decides from not hearsay is not the right word, from what they say, and if what they say as syllogistic proposition, if that follows. And the reason why we think that is strengthened by us hearing politicians debating each other, and they try to find, so to speak, logical holes in this syllogism. They turn them and they show that this doesn't hold. And of course, they are starting with all and the contradiction of all. And that means actually, do not forget that anything can be implied. That doesn't mean that you can come up with anything, and that you can come up with anything that at the moment sounds as something you can accept, something that sounds rational actually, or decent. That's another thing. But just because you cannot come up with it in the moment, or maybe never, the potentiality to come up with anything is always there. And that means that everything that is said can be objected to. And it's not so hard to see that's a gigantic problem on both sides. It's like a little bit you're throwing something in front of you, a stone. You're not thinking of the case, and you see where the stone is going. It could either go into a glass house, or it can go into the head of an old man standing there. You are damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. Doesn't matter where you come, it is not by itself. It doesn't work by itself. And I think this also have a connection to the passivity we mentioned so many times. Because the idea that logic or something does itself, and one doesn't have to know the details or get completely engaged in the stuff. That lends itself to standing outside and saying to oneself, it sounds good, it sounds decent. And any conclusions can, because of explosion, be made. There is no limit to it. And this will greatly help. I wish that a person like Jordan Peterson would read this. It's not a complicated article at all, but it clearly shows there is a big difference in the doings of Derrida and Foucault to what he thinks they are doing. Obviously, Jordan Peterson is confusing the two. Everyone is doing that. No one is an exception. And if you confuse all and some, you are bound to think that Derrida and Foucault are a menace to rationality itself, thinking itself, intelligence, skill, you name it. Everything that is decent and good. You see why the attack on Derrida and Foucault have been so massive the last couple of years, especially the last decade. It is massive, and the reason is, of course, they are not attacking thinking itself. They are exactly attacking this tendency. It's a tendency that destroys thinking. It doesn't help thinking, and you are simply not aware of it. Let me take the second one, the second objection. Two contradictions can't be true. I think that's an obvious one, and we're supposed to follow that every day. Let's look into it if it really holds. This is to the effect that contradiction cannot be true. Since one ought to believe only what is true, contradiction ought not to be true. This is, in a little nutshell, what it's about. And of course, this appeals to the law of non-contradiction, LNC. Nothing is both true and false. And the first thing we need to do is to distinguish clearly between the LNC and explosion, as they are very different. For a start, as we have seen, explosion is a relative newcomer on the logical scene. The LNC is not. It is true that some have challenged it, some pre-Socratics as Heraclitus, some Neoplatonists such as Cusanus, and some dialecticians as Hegel. But since the time of Aristotle, it is a principle that has been very firmly entrenched in Western philosophy. Its place in Eastern philosophy is much less secure. I would say it's even a poor deadbeat. The view that the LNC fails, that some contradictions are true, is called dialetheism. This is the viewpoint that Graham Priest himself is supporting. But one doesn't have to be a dialetheist to subscribe to the correctness of paraconsistent logic. Though if one is, one will. As we also saw, there are arguments that push us toward accepting dialetheism. Is there any reason why one should reject these a priori? Why, in other words, should we accept the LNC? And this is once more one of those questions that we usually don't ask ourselves. This is yet more one of those no questions. The LNC never been argued for otherwise than saying it's absolutely evident that's the case. If you go to the locus of the defense, you have to go to Aristotle's Metaphysics, to Gamma 4. It is a striking fact about the law that there has not been a sustained defense of it since Aristotle, at least of which I'm aware, Greenpriest said. Where were his arguments so good that it settled the matter? Hardly. There are about 7 or 8 arguments in the chapter. It depends how you count. The first occupies half the chapter. It is long, convoluted and tortured. It is not all clear how it's supposed to work, let alone that it works. The other arguments in the chapter are short, often little more than a throwaway remarks, and are at best dubious. Indeed, most of them are clearly aimed at attacking the view that all contradictions are true, or even that someone can believe that all contradictions are true. Aristotle, in fact, slides back and forth between all and some with gay abandon. His defense of the LNC is therefore little help. As I say, he never defended him in any obvious way, and he did not reach the LNC by thinking or going deeply into the matter. He got stuck with it, that's what I would say. It's a little bit like Newton getting stuck with his idea of time, space and scale. Once you're stuck, it's very hard to get unstuck. Let's continue. Well, you can make up some arguments and sort of distill it from common thinking, or general thinking here in the public in Sweden or any other Western country. And one first argument we make up is that contradictions have no content, no meaning. If that was the case, a fortiori, they have no true content. Contradictions cannot be true. The first thing to note about this objection is that not only an objection against dialecticism, but also against classical logic. For in classical logic, contradictions have total content. They entail everything. One who subscribes to orthodox logic cannot therefore veil this objection. Well, there have been some who endorse different propositional logics according to which contradictions do entail nothing and so have no content. But the claim that contradictions have no content does not stand up to an independent inspection. If contradictions had no content, there would be nothing to disagree with when someone uttered one, which there usually is. Contradictions do, after all, have meaning. If they did not, we could not even understand someone who asserted a contradiction, and so evaluate what they would say as false or maybe true. We might not understand what could have brought a person to assert such a thing, but that is a different matter. And at the same time is equally true of someone who in broad daylight asserts the clearly meaningful, it is night. The second objection, I think this is more interesting. Something you can find in Logicians Know About This, MacTaggart, is to the fact that if contradictions could be true, nothing could be meaningful. The argument here appeals to the thought that something that is meaningful only if it excludes something, and this is called omnis determino est negatio. A claim that rules out nothing says nothing. An obvious failing with this argument is, again, the slide from some to all. Violation of the LNC requires only that some statements do not rule out their negation. Whether that is supposed to mean, whatever that's supposed to mean. The argument depends on the claim that nothing rules out its own negation. But there is much more of a fundamental flaw in the argument than this. The premise that a proposition is not meaningful unless it rules something out is just plain false. It entails everything, yet is quite meaningful. It is, after all, false. If you are in any doubt of this, merely consider its negation. Something is not true. This is clearly true, and so it's meaningful. How could a meaningful sentence have meaningless negation? Think about that. How could it be that a meaningful sentence can have a meaningless negation? A third argument for the LNC, one that is typical of many, starts from the claim that the correct truth conditions for negation are as follows. Not A is true if and only if A is not true. Now suppose that A and not A is true, then assuming that conjunction behaves normally, A is true and A is not true is true. Hence the truth conditions of negation, A is both true and not true, which is impossible. It is not difficult to see what is wrong with the argument. For a start, the truth conditions of negations are contentious. More importantly, why should one suppose that it's impossible for A to be both true and not true? Because it's a contradiction. But it is precisely the impossibility of having true contradictions for which we are supposed to be arguing. The argument, therefore, begs the question, as do many of other arguments of which I'm aware. And this is widely interesting. Here we hear from logic itself the same thing that Derrida, Gachet, Heidegger, well, Heidegger wanted to get to paraconsistent logic. Dialetheism would have helped him immensely. One of his successors, Merleau-Ponty, is said to have come to that end point of actually endorsing dialetheism. I think that's most unclear. To get to dialetheism, we had to have this development within quantum mechanics. Yes, Merleau-Ponty was after quantum mechanics, partly, but it took some years until we understood that this actually causes a significant problem in daily life. This is not a philosophical problem only. I would say it's even more of an everyday problem than a philosophical problem, because it entails that we are getting tricked. The politicians I mentioned earlier on, we take their words as true or false on the basis of there being some sort of correlation between logic and rationality. Whatever that relationship can be, this clearly shows that relationship to be quite different, and that anything can be put in any sort of logical shape or frame, whatever you want. That is a criticism of logic. And this is the only instance where criticism is completely allowed, because it destroys this connection that never existed, but we don't construct anything by criticizing it. Here we can, without having any problem, cut the neck of the chicken, and we don't have to feel guilty. Maybe after we made a stew out of it and eaten too much, but we don't have to have any guilt in severing this connection. And this might be one of the most important things to do. And this can be also explained in different ways. This is the formal way, not the easiest way to understand, but it needs to be mentioned because it is just beyond belief what it entails. I will not do this next lecture, but I will go further into Graham Priest's lovely article at some other instant, because I think it's another approach is needed here to get closer to the mirror image and what it entails. I say thank you very much, and I wish you a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye.